So good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Morris. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for Global Development. Welcome to all of you. I think for some of you, this is a double header. You were here for the session that just ended with President Jin Lichun of the AIB. It was a good discussion. But we're here to address questions around debt risk, debt sustainability in developing countries. And we have an excellent panel to help us with that. I'm very excited, actually, to hear from all of our panelists. It's a diverse group, and we have the right gender balance for once. This is something that we strive for in all of our panels here. So what I would like to do is offer a few remarks for context. I'll introduce each of our panelists by their current titles, not their full impressive biographies. And then we will go directly into a conversation. We will leave some time toward the end for questions from all of you. So this topic, I would say, all of us who have spent years around the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF, we know that these meetings always have themes and even a certain tone to them. And I think it's fair to say with the meetings this week, while in many years it is about opportunities and achievements and achieving SDGs and other kinds of goals, sometimes it's more about avoiding bad things and managing risks. And I think it's fair to say for these meetings that is very much the tone. And particularly the question of debt risks have been, by design, part of the leading topics of discussion. In fact, so much so that we have a competing event at the World Bank right now on the question of debt transparency, where the bank president, David Malpass, is speaking. There are reasons for that, and we will discuss that in considering what the current landscape looks like in terms of debt risk and rising debt risks. In my quick review of the data and looking at the most recent posting, I think it was the September update from the bank on the risk ratings for countries, we now see 22 low-income countries that are either at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress, and by comparison, just 4 years ago, that number was 6. It is also the case, and this is, I think, where we want to spend a bit more time, is that the nature of the risks perhaps are quite different today than what we have seen historically, which is a function of a very different composition of debt, a different composition of creditors to developing countries, including and particularly low-income countries, which has a range of implications when it comes to the policy environment. How do the borrowing countries themselves manage these risks? And how does the international community, including multilateral institutions, but also governments, including government creditors, manage those risks? We have seen, and I was struck by some of the data that comes from the World Bank on assessments of borrowing countries around things like public financial management, their ability to do debt monitoring, that we actually have seen some deterioration here. That in fact, it may be that some countries are in worse shape today around this set of challenges than they had been in recent years, and obviously that's an area of concern. And then finally, I do think there are, again, on the creditor side, there are really critical questions today about how creditors coordinate. If we can't rely on traditional models or expect to rely on traditional models, how will creditors coordinate, either in avoiding crisis or mitigating and dealing with crisis in the event of debt distress? So that's our challenge for this morning, for the next 90 minutes or so. Let me very briefly introduce our panelists, and we'll get the discussion going. So we're going to go right down the row. First with Dr. Wencai Zhang, who is Director General of the Department of International Economic and Financial Cooperation at the Ministry of Finance in China. Dr. Vera Songwei, who is Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa. We have third doctor, Hanan Morsi, is the Director of Macroeconomic Policy Forecasting in the Research Department at the African Development Bank. We have Ms. Odile Reynaud-Bassot, who is Director General of the French Treasury and Chairperson of the Paris Club. And last but not least, certainly Dr. Chela Pazarbashalu, I did better in the green room, who is currently Vice President for Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions at the World Bank Group. So welcome to all of you. Wensai, let me start with you. How do you evaluate the external landscape today? How do you see debt risk? There's, as I said, there's a certain tone at these meetings. There are statements coming out of the bank and the fund about rising debt risk, but from where you sit in the Chinese finance ministry, how do you look at this issue?
Yeah, thank you, Scott, and very pleased to, let me see that, good morning, colleagues. I'm very pleased to join this morning's session. And I just came back last year from the Asian Development Bank, as I was here as the Vice President for the operations for the ADB, for the South Asia and Central West Asia. So now I took this position, in the Ministry of Finance. I saw many of my friends, here sitting, in a room. So I'm currently in charge of this, China's cooperation with many other MDBs, including the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and also AIB is a new, AI, IFIs, also NDBs, and of course some other bilateral AFD, KFW. Just very quickly, let you know what I'm doing now in the Ministry of Finance. See, like Scott said, that issue, that stability issue has become, a very, hard topic recent years. Like Scott said, for some of the, low-income country, particularly, they are facing more and more, debt, challenges. Some of their, they face some, high risk in debt distress. When I was the ADB, I visit those countries. I can see that. The ADB only provide grant money, instead of even the concessional loan, because of the country, is in a high risk. So not mid, moderate, middle level or lower level. So I can see that this is a big issue. We should really address these debt issues. In some of our countries, particularly low income, that developing countries. And but also I want to see that on the other hand, maybe later we can discuss how we can also address their needs for more development financing, right? As we talk about in recent years, how we help the country mobilize more resources, right, to support their development, and particularly for the poverty reduction before 2030. So this is the dilemma. On the one hand, we needed to address the debt issue, but on the other hand, how can we help the countries, right, to mobilize resources? And this is kind of challenges not only faced by the debt countries, also by the credit country, also like many IFI also, right, they also needed to, international organizations should also, right, to provide support. So I think and from China side, we attach great importance to the debt management issue, right? So as a what you call an emerging creditor or donor, or we have also have done a lot of investment in overseas, in other countries, particularly in the recent years, in Africa, in Asia, Latin America. So I think we certainly also want to join international community to help the country concerned to manage their the debt challenges. And as you know that last April this year we had the second BRI forum that in Beijing. And China Ministry of Finance also we launched issue a new kind of debt sustainability, what we call the debt sustainability framework for the BRI participating countries. And I think we are now working with IMF, World Bank, and others to try to implement this debt sustainability framework. And of course, that will involve a lot of trainings for the participating Chinese institutions. And also, of course, we were going to work with all the country concerned along the BRI corridors, to see how we can, use the framework to support, right, the debt management and for the country concerned. And also, we also try to get, another things we have been doing is that we also, have already got 28, countries Ministry of Finance to join us to also approve this guiding principle for on financing the development of the Belt Road. And so I think this is the second one. Third one is about we are working with the I think 8 IFIs, including World Bank, AIB, ADB, and many several other international organizations for set up the center, what we call the MCDF, Multilateral Cooperation Center for Development Finance. I think the Africa Development may also join us later, and NDB also, the New Development, join us. So we will have maybe 10, and maybe very soon we have 10 international organizations to join for this Multilateral Cooperation Center for Development Finance. This center will support 3 main things. One is about information sharing. Secondly, we will support capacity building, including capacity building for the debt management and others. And thirdly, we'll support also the project preparation for with the high standard, so with the IFI standard for the infrastructure, cross-border connectivity project, other with the high standard. So I just want, we are working on this, so we are also going to, as you know that I think we met with Ms. Masood the other day, yesterday, we talked about, about this, cooperation with others in the future. And we also already participated in, the meetings organized by the Paris Club, in the last few years. We will continue to join some of the meetings, to be organized by the Paris Club. So I think we're trying to understand how the Paris Club countries, how they, operate their system, how the Paris Club will do their operations. So we're trying to learn from our colleagues. So we are trying to, engage with the, international communities, so both the, debt countries, creditors, bilateral agency, multilateral agencies. And so we try to also, right, to make our, to join, right, the international efforts, right, to address these debt issues. Maybe I should stop here at the very beginning.
That's excellent. In fact, I think
Yeah.
you've teed up a lot of the key policy questions,
Yeah.
particularly in the creditor community and what behavior looks like there. Vera, so on this basic question, do you think sort of these growing expressions of concern about debt risk get it right? Are they overblown? Are they not aggressive enough? How do you view the current landscape?
First of all, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Scott. It is a conversation that we've been having now for almost 2 or 3 years, the debt conversation. And because we've been having it for so long, you almost feel like you've heard a lot of it already. But behind the debt conversation, I think are 60% of the young African population that is looking for jobs and that has aspirations for growth and has aspirations for a prosperous life. And I think that when we have the conversation just around debt distress and not debt distress, we lose a little bit the substance of what we're talking about. And what are we talking about when we're talking about debt? We're talking about an accumulation of investment that has either gone wrong or whose rate of return has not been good enough to be able to pay back for the resources. And so my sense is that when we ask the question as, countries in debt distress, you almost put the burden of proof entirely on the countries. There has been no conversation about the governance of the originator investment. And I do believe that we do need to start having a conversation on the governance of the originator investments. And that conversation is not happening yet. And I think that the more we go down the road of countries in debt distress, the less we talk about the originator investment. And I think we have now a good number of years where we have a good database of the 22 countries in debt distress and where is the debt coming from and what is the rate of return of the debt and who has the accountability of ensuring that when that debt is contracted, the rate of return actually does deliver something that is prosperous for those people that are looking for jobs. I think that's the first thing. The second thing that we do need to talk about is there are 55 countries, at least on the African continent. We have about 16 that are in debt distress. We have the rest that are not. We have a number that are, quote unquote, today being sort of moderate or low risk. However, we have done some work at the ECA that shows that overall, the rate of growth of debt, even in the countries that today we say are great, so let's go and pile them up with more debt, is growing quite fast. It's growing at about 10% on average. Clearly, recipe for disaster. So not only do we have a problem of countries, there's stock, which is big, but we have the rate of growth of those that are good that is going quite fast. And again, I think that there needs to be a conversation about what is the rate of accumulation that we can allow. Because my sense is when we have the conversation of, oh, they're already in debt distress, we're already in trouble. We have youth on the streets by that time, and we don't know what to do. I was in Sudan 2 days ago. Inflation 63%, debt to GDP 177%. What do you do? This conversation to those kids in Sudan who have just done a revolution, who have just come out, who are looking for a bright future in Algeria, in Ethiopia, this conversation for them is, and I think that the question is, can we get growth going on the continent in a way that is clearly, austerity is important, and austerity is, I think, the key, because if you don't have that kind of austerity, you don't get the growth that you need. But what kind of austerity for what kind of growth is the question that maybe we should start posing, and we will get to the debt question. The third thing that I wanted to talk about is that the revenue resource mobilization. Again, when we talk about debt, we're talking about the patient already in the hospital. The road to the patient being in the hospital is getting good domestic resource mobilization going. On average, domestic resource mobilization on the continent is 17%. In Sudan, it's 6%. So no surprise that to GDP is 177%. So again, there is a conversation. Are we doing the right things? I think there is not as much conversation on illicit financial flows as there is in Africa's debt crisis. We know that there is a huge amount of leakage on the continent. Why don't we bring those conversations together? And I think because of the transparency of the international world today, we cannot have these discussions and sort of, debt distress on one side, youth dividend on another, and illicit financial flows in a different platform. We must bring them together to ensure that at least we begin to get the whole story around debt together. I'm very happy to hear that many people have joined the new debt framework. There's a long conversation on the continent today about should we raise debt ceilings, shouldn't we raise debt ceilings? I have a belief that we should not, because part of it is responsibility, is responsible investment. And what is the intergenerational cost of raising those ceilings if today we are not accountable? And I'm very happy that we're talking about sort of getting, with Odile, this Paris Club and more transparency around the debt. I think that I'm one who says that every debt that is contracted should be on the internet. Let us know all the conditions, let's know all the terms, because these conversations, as long as we keep all the debt, when an IMF gives a loan and you can Google and find what they've done and what the terms are, let's do that for everybody, bilaterals, multilaterals, and private sector.
Good. We are, with both of you already, are confronting the policy issues head on, which is excellent. And I want to come back to each of these. Hanan, maybe to pick up on a point that Vera made about, while the focus is obviously, countries in distress, high risk of distress, there in fact is obviously a broader group of countries. And so for your client countries in Africa, how do you see the current picture, particularly in terms of emerging risk in those countries that we don't currently think of as being at high risk, but nonetheless, the rate of accumulation seems to be growing. What's your perspective on that?
So as Vera mentioned, we have the continent is a huge continent with 54 countries that are diverse, and the dynamics in them are different. So you have countries where you actually have countries that are in debt distress, and according to the IMF classification, it's like 7 of them. Then you have countries that are also in high risk group. But I think we need to maybe take a step back a little bit in terms of this phenomena of rising debt levels, whether for low-income countries or for the African continent, is a phenomena that is a global phenomena. It's not just for developing countries and African countries. Globally, all countries actually have built up debt over the last decade. And there is an economic rationale of it, which was the global environment that was historically low interest rate, favorable monetary conditions, and basically it made sense for many countries to utilize that opportunity, whether to help in terms of the maturity structure of their debt. Some countries, even African countries, were able to get international external debt that's cheaper than their domestic financing, like Cote d'Ivoire. So it was an opportunity, a global opportunity in terms of the alternative sources of financing that it offered, but also it came on a backdrop of declining concessional lending. So the availability of concessional lending have declined substantially. It used to represent around 45% for low-income countries. Currently, it's about 25% only. So that meant that along with the huge development needs of these countries, and we've done estimations in terms of infrastructure financing needs for the continent, which is estimated between 120 to 170 billion US dollars a year. This is humongous. For the continent to be able to do that, they need financing. So if this is not coming through the concessional financing, then they need to find other ways of actually achieving that. But also need to take into account that the dynamics also have changed, have evolved. So we have many countries now that are able to access international capital market. That phenomena did not exist before. So pre-HEBIC, it was only South Africa that was able to tap international capital markets. Currently, like in Africa, we have 18 countries. And that, in a way, is a testimony for also the improvement in terms of the macroeconomic fundamentals that these countries have done over the last 2 decades that actually enabled them to access the market. So in that sense, I mean, it's a positive development. I mean, it's what we would expect as countries move up, the development ladder, that they would be able to actually gain credibility, be able to tap international markets. But with that, of course, come risks, because you have debt that is more commercial, more market-based, with creditors that are beyond just the Paris Club group. So that means that you have to deal with interest rate risks, especially with the normalization of global interest rates. You need to deal with exchange rate risks. And most importantly, and I think this is the part that we're not emphasizing enough or focusing on enough, what that debt is used for. Because at the end, for the debt to be sustainable, it's not about the accounting of debt and the debt level. It's about what is this debt is being used for and what returns it generate in terms of, particularly for growth over the long term. So the more that we can focus the discussion on the use of debt rather than just the levels of debt, the better we are doing for these low-income countries. And we have done actually some work looking, for example, at the link between debt investment and growth. And we've seen that 10% increase in debt to GDP, external debt to GDP, usually leads about 4 to 5% increase in terms of investment, public investment. However, this link becomes weaker in terms of impact on growth for African countries relative to others. So yes, they still have, we still see positive impact or positive association between investment and debt, but it's not getting the level of growth returns as it's doing for other countries. And part of the things, the analysis that we've done show 2 issues that matter. One is the initial level of capital stock. So if you have higher initial level of capital stock, there is some sort of complementarity. You tend to actually, more investment will get you more returns. So this is one. So for the African countries, this is, of course, a bit of a disadvantage for some that they're not starting from a high level of capital stock. The other is the issue of, and I think this also has not been looked at that much, the issue of the private investment. So actually, to get the higher returns, you need to have a complementarity with private investment. You need to have a certain level or threshold of private development to be able, private sector development to be able to actually get higher returns. So these are things that we need, I think, to think of more. We are actually developing with the IMF colleagues a debt investment growth model that basically try to help countries actually kind of estimate for certain investments what it means for them long-term growth. We've helped Zimbabwe, we've helped Uganda, and we're getting more actually requests from Ethiopia, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. So these are the type of tools that can actually help countries, put their hands on in terms of planning what is it that they're gonna get them would be more efficient and higher returns for their investment.
Thank you. So Odile, let me ask you to speak from your position as chair of the Paris Club, and I hope we do talk more about the role that the club plays as a coordinating mechanism for official creditors, not all official creditors at the moment, and we should talk more about that. But I suspect that the club also serves a little bit as an early warning system or a platform to see the risks and emerging risks. So I wonder if you can offer some perspective of what you're seeing through trends in the club's deliberations in the current landscape.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me in this panel. Indeed, I would say that what we see as Paris Club creditors and heavily involved in these debt issues for a long term, and with the French Treasury ensuring the secretariat of this very informal body, which is not an international institution, but just a gathering of countries willing to cooperate to deal with debt issues in close collaboration with IMF and the World Bank. But I may come back to that. What we see currently is the fact three trends related to debt development. The first one is what, as it has already been mentioned, the increase of the number of countries in potential debt distress or at risk in terms of debt sustainability. And this is, from our perspective, very worrying in the sense that Paris Club creditors have been heavily involved in previous debt treatment, HIPIC initiative, and so forth. So we have already been through this sort of process where we at the end, we come with unsustainable debt level, which are which weight on development capacity. There has been a huge collective effort in the 90s, early 2000 to deal with this debt overhang, and with a strong commitment not to start again and to enter into this negative circle. And there we are at risk of having the same kind of difficulties. So that is the first trend, and I think this is what we are calling for: early action, early consideration, and so forth, not to get into the same place than we were in the late 90s. The second issue, which makes debt development worrying in a way, or more difficult to address, is the fact that the diversity of creditors is much wider, very different. You have new players, much more stronger share of private debt in the form of bonds. So all this makes, first of all, coordination more difficult, and possible solution, debt treatment, more difficult also. So this is a sort of fragmentation. In a way, it's a good news to have private creditors, to have more countries being involved, more countries providing some lending, but it's also, it's a source of complexity that needs to be addressed and answered. And the third element is a complexification of debt instrument. We used to work with bilateral official debt, Paris Club bilateral loans. There were the London Club with banking loans. Bondholders, it's already much more difficult to coordinate and to have appropriate solution. We are making progress with the CACs and so forth, but it's still a little bit more complicated. One big development that we have seen in a number of countries is collateralized debt, and this is a big issue for first of all, transparency matter, but also a capacity to renegotiate and to ensure that there is a fair treatment among creditors. So because you have some creditors with specific rights and that deserve specific, that will be treated differently. So that creates a lot of complexities, and also basically this kind of financing as very often not very transparent. So the other, it's very difficult to assess the country repayment capacity if you don't know exactly what are the contracts and what kind of commitments have been taken on the use of resources. So this is something which is a worrying development that need to be addressed. I do very much agree that all these issues and debt issues are a sort of shared responsibility. It's not like it's a debtor country sole responsibility, but the creditor and the lender has to be to have a responsible lending policy. And I think that's why we insisted so much, and we've put so much effort in the context of the G20 to agree on some principles for responsible finance, which are a two-way street. It's not, and I think that's something that we need to promote, because it's very easy otherwise to say, well, we extend loan, and then if it's the debtor sole responsibility. I think that we need, and all the creditors and lenders have to take into account the internal return rate of the project, the impact of the loan on the debt sustainability, and so forth. And that's why international coordination on these issues is so important, because you can have very easily free riding. If you have you have a group of creditors willing to coordinate and to have a responsible attitude, and then you have creditors not playing that, abiding by the rules or by the principle, then you have a big free riding issue. And that's why we believe that cooperation in assessing of the debt risk, but also in framing the financing is so important. There are a lot of discussion currently on what one kind of debt, which is export credit, where we used to have very precise OECD guidelines defining the conditions and the terms for the loan and so forth, as a little bit as we have for the OEDA, and there are a lot of discussion to expand and to enlarge the scope of countries participating to this kind of multilateral commitment of. So as to ensure that everybody abides by the same principle and that we have a sort of consistent approach. And this is also true with the private sector. There have been a lot of work, and there are a lot of coordination between the Paris Club and the IIF, so International Institute for Finance, which they had in 2004 agreed upon some principle for private financing. This has been updated. There have been a big work to try to define some common principle for the private sector players in terms of transparency and so forth. So this is not, this is a voluntary framework for private sector creditor to participate, but I think it's a very useful step to have this kind of benchmark and reference principle in order to try to avoid to get to a new debt crisis.
Great, thank you. Jayla, you are now free to say whatever you want in reaction all of these comments. But I hope one of the things you can address is thinking about the World Bank's agenda. We've already heard this tension between the goals on the investment side and then the challenge and risk posed by levels of lending. So for the bank to be espousing a billions to trillions agenda in recent years, and now suddenly we are very worried about debt risk. How are you thinking about that within the institution?
Okay, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be with such good panelists. So I'd like to say that there are three kinds of debt: good debt, bad debt, and ugly debt. And I think we need strategies to deal with each of these. And I cannot agree more with what Vera talked about, and then you also followed, Hannah. We need debt, right? Debt is, if it's good debt, we need it. We need it for development. We talk about all the infrastructure need, human capital gap, and all the developing economies which really need resources to be able to make progress. But I think it has to be good debt. It has to be debt which is to be used in productive investments. Bad debt, I think, is more of a capacity issue when people or those in power make decisions that are not necessarily without bad intentions, but that not necessarily with the commons. Ugly debt is when there are actually, when we go into issues like illicit financial flows and so on and so forth, when there's intention to use debt for own person. So I think there are different kinds of debt. And what we have been doing at the bank is really thinking about this issue in a much more comprehensive manner. And I have the luck of working with different groups, our governance practice, which works on tax and resource mobilization, our poverty group, which looks at the distributional impacts of these issues, and of course our macro group, which looks at debt. And I think we need to look as a continuum. How are public investment decisions made? All this public investment management, public expenditure reviews, which look very carefully at what the money is being used for, what taxes are raised, what other resources are there to be able to use the available domestic and other resources. Capital market development, really trying to use as much as possible private finance to fill the gaps of whatever it's human capital or physical capital and so on. So I think that's the first bucket. In terms of the bad lending practices, I think there we need to, again, work with countries in terms of technical capacity development to make better choices. And that goes to these issues of identification, monitoring, better decision-making, and transparency, being transparent about. And I'd like to be pragmatic and say, okay, whatever was done in the past, fine, let's try to address the legacy problems. We're not going to be able to do everything, but at least going forward, newly issued debt, let's be transparent on that. Let's be more careful in explaining what that is used for, because at the end of the day, it's the next generations that are going to pay for it, not the current generation. And clearly there's a mismatch between the policymaker today and their objectives versus what needs to be in the long run interests of the public at large. And then the last bucket, which is the most difficult one, what I call ugly debt, where there's a lot of issues with corruption and illicit financial flows, and this is a very difficult agenda. We have been working on it very hard at the bank. Now we are also working very closely with our IMF colleagues, of course, many of the MDBs as well. I think here, we really need to, again, I hope technology will help with more transparency, more digital tracking of what money is being used for. But I do think we need a much more comprehensive look at this issue. It's not just, which was very well said before, it's not just, that we have a debt problem right now that we need to focus only on that, but at its continuum and try to understand different drivers for different contexts and provide support as much as we can through really good established mechanisms in terms of international coordination, regional coordination, as well as country-specific measures. I want to end with one thing, and that is we are talking a lot about that transparency and so on, is also the types of borrowers. And we are now concentrating a lot on sovereign debt, but there's also this huge contingent liabilities through either state-owned enterprises or some sort of implicit guarantees. And there also, I think, we need to be much more transparent, which unfortunately is not the case right now, but that's a key part of the agenda.
And I think raises the question of, in the assessments that we have today, how much of the full picture are we getting in assessing risk? That, by orders of magnitude, are we undercounting? I think this is a real challenge. Well, thank you all on that round. I think what I want to do, we try to be self-aware here, and as excellent as our panel is, I should acknowledge that in two key ways we are not well represented. One, we don't actually have private creditors on this panel, while we should acknowledge that private creditors are a much larger part of the landscape, particularly for low-income countries compared to the case historically. And frankly, we don't have borrowing countries directly represented. So, acknowledging that, let me try to focus all of you on your roles in the system. And I think what's striking to me is we have both what we would call a traditional creditor, bilateral creditor in France, and then the Paris Club more generally. We have what has been called a non-traditional creditor, but really let's acknowledge that China as an official creditor today has emerged as by some measures, the largest official creditor in the world. And then we have this set of multilateral institutions that wears multiple hats, both as creditors, with efforts to be norm setters, coordinators, all of those roles. So let me ask each of you, this will be the round where I ask for self-criticism in terms of where are you falling short in your, let's call them responsibilities to your client countries, whether if they are borrowers, as creditors, your responsibilities to other creditors. What does coordination look like, and where are you falling short as an actor in this system? What does that look like for you? Where do you see the need for your institution or your governments to be doing a better job? I do think I'm within striking distance of Wensai, so I'll be careful here. But let's acknowledge, and I'll use the word in a value-neutral way. China has clearly been a disruptor in the creditor community, and we, in the sense that it has so quickly emerged as a dominant source of development finance for developing countries, by design, helping to support these very large infrastructure programs, but frankly doing so in a way that does not, without participation in traditional fora like the Paris Club, or until, as you noted, with the introduction of a debt sustainability framework in the spring, something like that is an articulated policy framework for addressing debt risk. So I do think, beyond Wensai, your views, others talking about the particular case of China as a creditor, I think would be helpful. But in any event, I'll open it to any of you in any order. Actually, I should acknowledge that Jayla does have to leave due to another commitment. So I'm going to ask her to go first, and then we'll
everyone else can think in the
yes.
meantime. Okay, great. Just very briefly, I think there's much, self-criticism is always good because you can improve yourself. The bank has been very transparent in terms of and IFC as well, our private sector arm, in terms of the borrowing, the conditions. You can look at the internet and you'll get all the information, and I hope other MDBs will follow suit as well. So there, I think the bank has been a role model, and that's important. Where I think we need to do much more as the bank is what I talked earlier. Really take a much more fuller, comprehensive picture as we lend to countries. Do they have the capacity? Do they have the monitoring capacity? Do they have the capacity to issue good debt? And really, I think we should be accountable as we work, especially on development policy loans, to ask that question: is this money used for good purpose? And do they have the technical capacity? If not, really help them. And that's the key. We have now our International Development Assistance IDA 19 priorities, and this is at the center of it.
And could I just very quickly ask you to characterize that agenda within, IDA is the leading source of concessional finance in the world. It always comes with a robust policy agenda. How is that shaping up? Your deputies are meeting to wrap things up this weekend. How will they address this? I mean, can you give any examples?
So just very quickly on that, and I have to run to a meeting related to this actually. We are putting in place, in the context of IDA 19, debt transparency, governance, and institution is the key pillar, is one of the key pillars of IDA 19. And the other one is jobs and economic transformation. So you need both legs to be able to make progress. And with the IDA 19, we're also introducing sustainable development, finance principles, which is basically to make sure that IDA countries put in place the necessary competencies and capacities to be able to be transparent and manage and monitor their debt. So that's going to be a key component of IDA going forward.
Okay.
And apologies to the panelists.
Thanks very much for joining us. Any critical self-reflections? from the rest of the group or otherwise?
Maybe, from, if I take the Paris Club perspective, I think one of the issue on which we need to work is first anticipation, because and to be forward-looking. Because Paris Club creditors, they gather very often, but they check when they have arrears, and they are ready to intervene for debt treatment when the problem is there. So when the country is facing difficulties, cannot repay, and so forth. So it's more curative than preventive, and so it's, in a way, it's a little bit it's too late. So I think that being able to anticipate, and to be frank, I think that this time, this issue of building up debt and so forth has been on the agenda and discussed at length, and I think we try to find ways to bring the issue at the official, in the official debate and so forth, raise awareness of the risk ahead. So I think that's something which is positive, but probably we can do even better. And then I think one of the big issues we are facing is how to bring all creditors around the table, because I think that the kind of mechanism we are working with is a sort of, as I was saying, it's a non-informal group of countries willing to cooperate and to coordinate their actions so as to be more efficient and to avoid free riding and so forth, so to principle of collective action. What the debt development I was mentioning, so enlargement of the different creditors, including official with China, for example, and new creditors with emerging countries playing a bigger role in lending to development countries. This raises the issue of how to bring or to ensure that we have all the relevant creditors around the table and so forth. And this is the ongoing first of all, enlargement process, because we had, first of all, Russia, then Brazil, Korea joining the Paris Club. We also have the possibility on an ad hoc basis, because it's to have, when a country, not full member, have strong, large exposure to a debtor country, to invite them and to bring them on board. So it's this is a sort of very informal, flexible way of working, which I think is very relevant. And I think we have a lot of discussion with China on how China participating as an observer to understand how things work and how the Paris Club works, what can be its value added, what kind of organization you need in terms of debt management. When you are a creditor, you need to be aware of all the different categories of debt you have to manage: ODA, export credit. You can have sub-sovereign debt, which are relevant for the Paris. So, even just this capacity for a government to know all the exposure it has and to manage that properly, I think that's something which is needed to participate, and this is something that I think on which, for example, China has made a lot of progress with the debt framework they agreed upon. So that's something which I think is, in my view, the key challenge we have to deal with. And the last one will be cooperation with the private sector, which you can have we have a dialogue. We try to progress with the IAF principle and so forth, but deepen this common understanding, possibly evolution of practices and so forth. This is something we can make progress.
So maybe Wednesday this would be a good opportunity for you to respond. And let me suggest, and what I heard from Odile is, perhaps the relevant question isn't the one that you might think I would ask you, which is, will China join the Paris Club? It really may not be that question as much as what does coordination look like going forward, whether it's ad hoc on a country-by-country basis. But how are you evaluating this in terms of China's role?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I think right now, your question is about, China is, is a creditor, particularly in recent years. But of course, we are not that new, China has been doing this, kind of support for other developing countries within the framework of South-South cooperation for many years already. But of course, maybe in recent years, we try to provide more support to other developing countries. even China is still a developing country, right? You know that. Even we still borrow. My World Bank's colleagues not here. We still borrow money from World Bank and Asian Development, right? And also from other IFI, right? At the same time, we try to provide the support to other developing countries. So we are like a kind of creditor, and also we are also the borrower, right? To some extent from outside. So I think, but now as I mentioned, that China has been also attached great importance to these debt issues in other countries, particularly low income countries. We joined this IDA dialogue, the current ongoing one, IDA 19 discussion. And how we managing our colleagues the debt level in low income countries. So I think we have been working with IMF, World Bank, and also to try to implement the newly launched debt certificate framework I mentioned last April. So we're going to do some training together with the two, the IMF, World Bank, and others. Try to help our own institution, right, to implement this debt certificate framework as do the overseas investment in the coming years. And I think with this framework in place, China Central also is going to select some countries as pilot and for use of this framework, and to see how we can further improve the framework. The debt certificate framework in the future. So I think we are really also as a responsible country, right? As creditor, we also very much care about the debt management. We also want to see the money to come back, right? When we provide money to other countries, right? So we also care about that issue. And of course, we, like many of my colleagues said, because we feel many countries still need support. They need financial resources. So how can we help them to identify good project with good return, particularly for those productive purpose, right? So that project can itself, particularly for those projects who can generate revenues. That'd be good, right? So we are going to working with the recipient countries, with the international organizations, to play our part for the debt sustainability. We joined the G20 discussion, on the sustainable financing, so I think so I can assure you, we are the very responsible country. We want to, also, right, to play our role here, even maybe we're not so, experienced as other traditional creditor like OECD country and others, but we try to also to learn from others. And so I feel that, like I said at the very beginning, we already joined, some of the discussion, organized by the Paris Club. And, so of course we are not members of Paris Club right now, but we already, attend some of the discussion, right, organized by the club. So we, so I think, let's see how we can further, right, to play our role in the future. So I think your question about the differences of the traditional creditor vis-a-vis the new creditor, to my understanding, because by nature, right, there's no fundamental difference. Of course, new creditors, they may not have so much experience as a traditional creditor, right? So, even some new creditors, they are still themselves, they are still developing country, right? So, but they try to help others. So, of course, as they do more investment in other countries, they also needed to learn from others. So, of course, they in terms of difference, I don't see the big difference, right? They also care about the risk, for their investment in other country. Of course, maybe different creditor may have different financial terms, in terms of lending to other countries, or maybe you have different lending procedures. I can see among the different creditors, both multilateral and bilateral creditors, right? Even among the MDBs, right, we see some of difference there. All right, of course, bilaterals also, right? They are doing the things maybe also with some different kind of way, right? But anyway, so I think that's why we are trying also support the efforts, right? International effort for more coordination, more cooperation among the key players. So let's see how we can strengthen dialogue, at the country level. And what is really important that I think we need to support our receiving country, right, to formulate a good strategy, good country platform program, so that when you support them, we are sure that those projects will be really sustainable, right, economically, financially, environmentally, socially. So I think so that's something very important, right? So from very beginning. So I think that, and also even for the new multilateral development banks, right? Like AIB and NDB, I myself, are a board director for both. So I joined the board for this, the discussion for AIB and NDB. So you met with President Jean maybe just before this session. So we also really encourage the new bank, right, to also to provide more sustainable financing, right, for our developing countries, for the infrastructure development, for sustainable development. So we also ask the management tool bank, right, to use the standard, right, international standard, to prepare a project with good quality, to make sure that, the project are really sustainable at the end of the day, and with a big development impact. So I think, but they are trying to do something different with the traditional MDBs, right? I think maybe you already heard something from the president of AIB, right? They're trying to do something maybe innovative, right, as a new MDBs. So I think we should encourage that also, right, in the coming days. So I feel, these days we should allow, right, kind of diversity of the kind of, right, more innovative things, right, to be done by the new multilaterals or maybe by the new bilateral, agencies. But of course, we need to respect, some of the very basic fundamental principles. But at the same time, each maybe creditor may have their own practice, their own procedures, their own maybe, so I think we needed to also respect that, because otherwise you try to adopt the one fits all kind of approach, right, for all the criteria. I don't know whether at the end of the day that really work or not, but I think we needed to encourage that kind of, right, innovative things to be done by the new creditors. I just want to mention also here, of course we should try to encourage the new creditor to do more harmonization or try to more coordination with the traditional one. But at the same time, we also need to, right, to allow the new creditor to do something new, something more innovative. Maybe I should stop here.
Adil, you wanted to respond on.
Just one comment on from a debtor perspective. I think that the value of coordination, having, you could believe that having a group of creditors negotiating with the debtor, it puts you at a disadvantageous situation, because you have all the creditors and you are the debtor in front of them. I think this is the other way around, and I think that for the debtor country, having a multilateral framework to deal with debt restructuring is in a way very protective, because then you have, the only criteria and the only, the key parameters that are taken into a debt restructuring when discussing the Paris Club is what is needed for the country in terms of financing or debt alleviation for the support of the program. And you cannot have bilateral, arguments saying, well, I can restructure your debt if you buy me something. You do not have this kind of bilateral discussion, because you have a collective discussion with the key purpose being to finance the IMF program and to provide the needed debt relief for the program. And I think this is, in a way, very protective for the country, because you do not have, pressure. When you need to have a debt restructuring and you are alone with your creditor, the pressure can be very high. So I think that's something which is one of the value added of the framework, which is which we need to protect. And I fully understand the fact that new creditors, you need it may be different approach and so forth, but this value added of having something which is based on the same principles and with a collective aim and not bringing bilateral issues is very important, I think.
Thank you. Vera?
No, thank you. I think three things. The first is one of the things that we need to do better. I go back to your question a little bit on what let's self-criticize, is I think unpacking the data and just getting a better sense of who is doing what way. And in some way or the other, we have had a long conversation here today about sort of Chinese debt. Chinese debt is 20% of Africa's overall debt, just to put it in perspective. So it's not sort of the big part of Africa's debt when one looks at it directly. Now, in the recent times, it is true that a lot of the countries that are tilting towards high risk of debt distress are countries that have had quite an amount of Chinese debt. However, 2 or 3 of the big, most onerous debts on the continent have come from private sector. BNP in Mozambique, we know $11 billion in the drain. And the question is, are we also holding to account those kinds of institutions that are issuing Eurobonds and that in the European community are actually accounting for a big share of this conversation around debt distress? And I think the third part is on the state-owned enterprises. And when we talk about the new Chinese debt model, I think a big conversation has been on the question of contingent liabilities and whether we account for them or not. In many economies, contingent liabilities are SOEs that are very opaque. And so, the question of saying, should we take out the contingent liabilities of SOEs from the debt model is probably a very risky proposition, because it may work in China because it's a sort of centralized state and government, but it may not work someplace else. And that is a particularly important part of when we start unpacking debt and we start looking at the SOE segment. At the end of the day, in many of the countries, the SOEs are just an extended arm of the government. They really are public debt. So I think beginning to pass the question and saying, let's take out public debt from SOEs. I mean, we look at South Africa, anybody who's read the FT today sees the ESCOM crisis, which is essentially the South African crisis. So it's difficult to say that you will talk about South Africa's debt without talking about ESCOM in that sense. So again, I think what we have not done well is unpack the data to say where is really the debt, who is causing it, and how is it, and where are some of the culprits. And maybe sometimes an excessive focus on one sort of source of it makes us oblivious to the rest. And so as we focus maybe, and let's just say it, in Chinese debt, the Eurobonds are creating havoc all over the place. And maybe there needs to be a certain degree of accountability on that side too, which today we are not yet seeing in the way. And the international community has done a fantastic job of bringing BNP Paribas and the rest to task on the Mozambique issue, which I think was egregious. And I think that kind of precedent setting is important to show that nobody is above the law and you need to do it, and it takes two to tango. So that's, I think, the first thing that we need to do. The second one, I think, is a conversation around local currency debt. And we have not had enough of a conversation on local currency debt. A lot of the debt is financing local expenditures. It's financing a railway, it's financing housing, that are all debt, all expenditures that happen in local currency, payable in local currency. And so I think beginning to build, and Taylor has left, that beginning to build local capital market structures that can, one of the reasons why South Africa is still standing today is because 80% of their debt is in local currency, so they can afford it. The same as that's why Italy didn't go down and Greece went down. And so if you begin to look at, the lessons we've learned from the rest of the world in terms of making sure then that some of your debt is backed by local currency, gives you a little bit more cushion, a little bit more stability to actually take a little bit more up. Benin is a country in question. Benin had a fiscal deficit of about 12%, with a lot of local currency debt incurred to build infrastructure, which then took its growth rate back to 7% and its deficit back to 3.2%. So there are different models in which we can do this, and I think we do need to look at that and see whether this whole conversation around local currency lending is something that we need to be more focused on, which we have not done. You asked for criticism and what we want to do. And finally, I go back to a point that I made before. It's resource mobilization. We honestly cannot have the conversation on debt. Today, we do have a lot of effort that is spent talking about debt, and particularly external debt. But let's remember that African countries still, to the tune of over 75%, fund their own development with revenue mobilization. So at the end of the day, for all the conversations that we are having, multilateral funding for development is at the maximum 20-25% of development expenditure. Countries are still funding own resources. So if we really want to get to that place of prosperity, of leaving no one behind, of SDGs in 2030, I think the conversation on how we raise more local financing, how we raise debt, and there is a lot of, I think, room, particularly using new disruptive technology, to collect and increase revenue is still possible.
Good, thank you. Hanan, any comments here before we turn to the audience, please?
I totally agree on the issue of data. And I think it's something that all of us need to collaborate to get that going. Because not only it will help in terms of perception and ability to assess, but it will help as a policy tool going forward on how to make decisions. So this is vital. I think one of the things that we've been doing, but I think the needs are far more than what has been done, is the issue of capacity building. And here in particular, things such as capacity building in identifying, designing, and structuring bankable projects that the government can do. So part of the problem is, even with good intentions, how you go about doing public investment may get you in trouble. So actually building the in-house capacity to be able to do that, to be able to design the projects, monitor, evaluate, is key. At the African Development Bank, we've been helping, but I think part of the plan going forward is to actually expand these efforts so that you can build capacity with governments. But also, I think doing more, for example, of the things we've done it historically with the World Bank, things like expenditure reviews, to be able even not just in total public expenditure review, but even at a sectoral level, so that you can pinpoint what worked, what didn't work, how you can make it better going forward is key. At the country level, I mean, also what we found that it really helps having ownership, having some sort of independent entity that goes afterwards and assess the efficiency of the expenditure that was done. For example, Kenya had that. So having ownership in terms of assessing at a national level what has been done, was it worth it, did you get the returns, is key. And the extent to which we can actually help countries achieve that would go a long way.
Great. Okay, so let's take a handful of questions. We'll take three. Start back here, in the middle here, and then right here. Wait for the microphone. Brief questions and introduce yourself as well. Rory.
Rory McFarker from MasterCard. This is a question for Winsai. In the context of your new BRI framework, do you feel that at the Ministry of Finance, given the wide array of Chinese institutions that are extending credits in the BRI, that you have a full picture of all of China's exposure to different emerging markets? So you know how much the China Development Bank is lending, how much China Exim is lending, and so you, in your current seat, can actually manage China's overall creditor exposure to these countries.
Thank you.
Okay, let's
maybe later.
Right here in the middle.
My name is Stacey Warden. I run Global Market Development for the Milken Institute. Same question for Dr. Zhang. Whereas 80% of U.S. aid meets the OECD definition of overseas development assistance, ODA, only 21% of Chinese aid meets that definition. And so this is the cynics amongst us might say that the China debt strategy was really about kind of exporting Chinese manufacturing capacity given investment and consumption imbalances at home. But nevertheless, you've got indebtedness of, the Chinese-Laos railway is 50% of GDP, of Laos's GDP. GDP, not budget. The debt service on the Sri Lankan port that China then took over was 95% of the budget, just the debt service. The numbers are murky and not well reported, so forgive me if I get them wrong, but debt to Venezuela is $68 billion. This is a country that can barely feed itself. Debt to Pakistan, $65 billion. So my question is, I don't think this time is different either, right? And since it's not ODA, I guess you're expecting to get that paid back. But 27 countries on the Belt and Road have a junk credit rating. Another 14 on the Belt and Road are not rated at all. So you've already restructured, I think, according to Rhodium Consultancy, $50 billion of debt. So my question is, as you look at this clearly, do you really expect to be paid back by these countries? And if not, what are you going to do in terms of debt restructuring and debt writing off? Or is it really, and this is maybe a rude question to ask, but is it really about the collateral at the end of the day? And then last, if you do that kind of debt restructuring and put those policies in place, what is that going to do to overall Chinese indebtedness, which is what, 250% of GDP at this point? So thanks.
Okay. Wensai has his plate full. This gentleman,
hope
do you have a
you
question for the other
Yeah, maybe
panelists?
some other panelists. Not only for me.
Yes.
Brief
Okay.
comments.
Just say too difficult.
Questions,
Yeah, it's too
please.
difficult. Yeah.
Question? No.
Oh, we're taking questions. Do you have a question for the other panelists? Okay, go ahead.
I have a generic question that any one of you can, I hope, answer. I'm in a pickle. On the one hand, I agree with everything that you said, but on the other hand, I'm bothered by the fact that I've heard this discussion the last 10, 20 years, etc., in different manifestations with different additions and subtractions to it. And I wonder whether we, and I include you and include me, are the parties that are supposed to know about this. Are we really accountable for the results that we are achieving? Do we have any skin on the game? If I compare this discussion with what we have lived back home in Chile, where we did it all on our own. The World Bank didn't come, the IMF didn't come, and we did our reforms to attract foreign investment, generate the surpluses, provide capital markets, have a series of things, including what you are saying, evaluating and all that. But the people have their jobs on the line, and therefore there is the oomph to make it happen. My question to you, I hope you have a good answer, you have thought a lot about it. Where does the oomph come so that you and your colleagues are really accountable and really make things happen? Because I heard this discussion before. I would like the next year when I come to hear some great results.
I've already asked you to be self-critical. I don't know if we're going to pile on more, but maybe this gentleman's question, how much do your institutions and governments matter on this question versus the primary responsibility of borrowing country governments? If maybe we take another round at that, and then Wensai, if you want to address the questions directed to you.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I think let me start. You will continue to hear this. I'll disappoint you. You will continue to hear this conversation for a long time. For the simple reason that it also, at the end of the day, and maybe this was the conversation about saying that we don't have any country member states with us on the podium, it at the end of the day is the responsibility of the government and a decision of the government that it actually does want to go from point A to point B in a manner that delivers growth and jobs for its citizens, and that there is a mechanism for accountability within the country. I think to believe that we have the mechanism for accountability is false. We sit here and have a mechanism for accountability on external debt. And essentially, we can make some noises about external debt, and Venezuela is a case in point. But there is only that much we can do. So at the end of the day, we can sound some alarms. We can put in some benchmarks that allow us to make sure that those countries that want to do well know what to take into account. They can learn from the Chile example and other good examples. But essentially, I remain convinced, and that's why I always go back to domestic resource mobilization, as actually a benchmark for accountability. The more accountable governments are, slowly, the more revenues they begin to collect. And you can almost do a one-to-one mapping of that on the continent. And I think until we get more accountability on that side, we will continue having this conversation and sort of slowly get more countries on the, I think today, to be fair to the African continent, there's a lot more countries going, we've gone from 10 to 17, countries have made an effort. We need to get to 35, but with global growth slowing, it's a much more difficult challenge. And I think that is where the conversation becomes a little bit more difficult and may take a little bit longer. But I think our role is to make sure that we can, when we say what have we done right, is that we make sure that if countries want to go on the right track, they know exactly what to do. And what have we done wrong is if countries are going off, that we tell them early, not late, when it's too late, that they're going on off the track. But we hope that many more countries follow the Chile example and do as well as you did.
Maybe, from a creditor perspective, I think the accountability, and it's a true one, is related to the fact that we do not want, and we are held accountable for our parliament and so forth, that we don't want to land and with having losses at the end. I think that's something, a big shift in for countries like France, that going through all the debt cancellation, EPIC and so forth, we do not want, and I think we'd be in trouble with our parliament if we were to provide huge amount of financing and then at the end in 5-10 years say, well, we have to cancel everything. And to be honest, this is something we really take into account, and we have a lot of internal discussion because you have some pressure to give lending from the debtor country who wants to borrow. You have some project companies want you to finance, and we have to stick, and we are doing that very seriously, to ceilings, debt sustainability analysis, so as to avoid, and this is something which is our share of accountability in this whole process.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think a lot of very challenging question for me to answer, but I think in China, that we have a different ministries in charge of different things about our lendings to other countries. We have a Ministry of Finance here. We have Ministry of Commerce. We also have NDRC. that, and also and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And of course, we have we just create a new agency. What do we call the China? Agency for International Development Cooperation. So last, I think last year. So, and that certainly, we also have these important players like for the overseas investment, like. China Development Bank, China Exim Bank, of course some other, also state-owned commercial banks, and so we have a lot of players for the overseas investment and lending, right? So certainly we needed to further improve our internal coordinations among the different players, different ministries, banks or agencies, in the coming years. So. Certainly, so that there's a need for us also to improve our, system, right, on the management of our sovereign debt, right, in other countries. So I can see that, we are fully aware of that, the need for that, and so that we can have a better capacity, right, to know what we have done, in other countries, So I think certainly there's a room for the improvement, right, from our side. We can learn from others how they manage it here, particularly maybe from the OECD country, how they manage their also external debt, right, their sovereign debt in other countries, as I said. So, and also that some colleagues mentioned about, how we make sure that we can get the money back from our project, right, particularly along the BRI corridors. I think that the government really attach importance to the fiscal, commercial, financial stability of our investment in those countries. So certainly, we want to get the money back. That's why we are attaching more and more importance to the debt management, debt stability issue, right? So in the coming days, and also we of course we really we encourage our participating financial institutions and companies, right, to really evaluate the risk they may face in different countries, right? So sometimes they are not so experienced in assessing the risk, for the country they invest, right? But certainly, we think we really really need to ask our, financial institutions, right, to further, right, to enhance their own capacity on management of risk. And of course, we also need to have further improve our dialogue, with the country concerned, right, to really to select a good project, for their own sustainable financing, for their sustainable development. So I can see that in some of the projects, in some countries, we support their, road, railway, and energy sector project, water supply, that kind of project, right? So project itself can generate revenue, that'd be good for the debt repayment. Some maybe, like a project in the social sector, the government needs to borrow, for those kind of projects, right? So they need to maybe use their government money to pay the debt back to the creditor. So I think, in general, I just want to mention to you that, I cannot say, for sure we'll, have no risk at all, right? For all the projects we have done or we will do in the future. But certainly we will, try our best to manage the risk in the coming days. So, but I think that so far you see a lot of investment along those BRI corridors, right? Already produce a very good result. Of course, you cannot see all the projects are successful, but still, right? This is the case for any creditors. You cannot guarantee successful all your project. So, but I think based on the World Bank study on the so far, right? I think not only for China's event, but other players' investment, you see that the many projects already really produce a very good development impact, like job creation, that infrastructure development, poverty reduction, because as you have more connectivity project, particularly for a cross-border connectivity, right, project, that really help reduce the transportation costs, travel costs, that can promote more intra-regional, inter-sub-regional kind of, investment and trade. So we do see a great potential here for more support for the physical, infrastructure, project, right? Particularly for those cross-border. So with more connectivity here, that really can promote more trade and investment, and also can help support more, the development, this called value chain, right? What we call, even a regional value chain or global value chains. So I feel that, I cannot see, we have success in all the projects we have done so far, but I think we are trying to really to improve our development impact, right? In all the projects we are doing, maybe, and also for all the projects we are going to do in other countries. So that's why you see, we said very clearly, in the second BRI forum, right? China will, use the international, right? Internationally accepted standard to support, high quality, BRI project. We made it very clearly, right? You heard about that, very clearly we said that. So you have our commitment right here. So I think nobody's perfect, right? But we can also try to improve ourselves in the coming days. So I don't know. So Scott, I address my colleagues, question or not. But anyway, that's what I can say now.
I'm not going to render a judgment, but that will have to be the last
Yeah,
word.
that's right.
Please join me in thanking our excellent panel today.
Yeah.